Our next speaker is Vivienne Ming, who's going to be speaking on transhumanity. She's named one of the 10 women to watch in tech in 2013 by Inc. magazine, is a theoretical neuroscientist, technologist, and entrepreneur. She co-founded SOCOS, where machine learning and cognitive neuroscience combine to maximize students' life outcomes. She's also a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, where she pursues her research in neuroprosthetics. In her free time, Vivienne has developed a predictive model of diabetes to better manage the glucose levels of her diabetic son and systems to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. Please welcome Vivienne.
So I strongly suspect, and I hope someone can shut this screen off, that you've been watching slides for a while now, so no slides for our finish here. I'm just going to talk, and I started my day off walking with my son. I came from up in Berkeley. I actually started with a joint appointment here at Stanford and Berkeley, so don't hate me just because I come from the better of the two now. But I came down from Berkeley with my son. We started our day off by walking up to Phil's. I get my morning chai, and as we're walking back down, I said to him, "You know what rhymes with orange?" And he said, "No, it doesn't." Okay, so it just took a minute for you to catch up there. And then he started to think about, okay, so what does rhyme with orange? It's one of these weird and somewhat challenging words where, because of its structure, do you have one?
No word in English rhymes.
No word rhymes with, the only thing that rhymes with orange is some variant of orange, which by its inherently does not, but he tried. He tried to come up. There could be. And we could try it all. In fact, if we were an AI, we might just try all of the words because we wouldn't necessarily know ahead of time. It's one of the interesting things about artificial intelligence is its approach to problems is to go vast, to go big. As is set up there, AlphaGo tended to take this very sort of novice approach to beating its opponents, which was just like total war. And often didn't use very sophisticated strategies. When you look at an expert playing chess or Go, by the way, this has nothing to do with my talk, not even the dumb jokes. I just wanted to warm up the room a little bit. And then we had kids, and I realized I wasn't going to go where I was about to go, which was what pornge might actually mean in the English language. But think about it hard, why it wouldn't be appropriate for a kid and add Donald Trump. So the approach of human beings, if you want to know, when you look at experts, they don't look at thousands of possible moves. In fact, they typically only evaluate a few of them. It just happens to be they're the right few. And it's not magical how it gets done, but it is amazingly sophisticated and complicated. And I think about why humans. It's amazing that I ended up in something that leads into my talk. Why humans are so great at things that they do, some of which has inherently to do with creativity. And machines are so great at what they do, and yet we, despite some of the PR behind deep neural networks, we're really doing very different things. And I always thought, what if we could marry the two of them together? So the title here about transhumanism is not really me. It probably is a fair description of the kind of work that I do, but it sort of evokes some person who spends 5 hours a day making certain their hair looks just the appropriate amount of mad scientist. And that's not really me. I actually come from this vein, which is how many lives are saved? How much better can we make human life? And in that sense is where I came. I had a fairly rough point in my life, and I went back to school. And I was trying to figure out what to do. What degree could I do which would have an actual meaningful difference on the world? And I ended up literally flipping a coin between economics and cognitive science. This is UCSD, where Jeff Hinton was. It was the first ever cognitive science department in the world. And it came up heads. So it turned out I was a neuroscientist. And I thought I'd just be a wet neuroscientist, which is to say, take wires and just jam them into cat brains and see what happens. And then I got introduced to this place called the Machine Perception Lab. And there I learned how to build neural networks, amongst other things. And back then it was those old 3-layer neural networks. But what we were doing with it was truly fascinating and a little morally gray, we were doing real-time lie detection for the CIA. And there's this question, will AI take jobs? And there's some interesting answers to them. One of my favorite answers was actually a cartoon. It's two horses watching a Model T drive into town. And one horse says to the other, I'm not worried. The wheel, the plow, new inventions always mean more jobs for horses. So past performance is not always the best indicator of future returns. But in this case, it was, if you could put aside whatever you might feel about doing work for the CIA, it was incredibly fascinating. I thought I'd be studying human brains and doing human stuff, and it turned out we could build these things on their own that could learn how to do something so complex, like read a facial expression, that it seems very deeply human. And I loved it, and there's an interesting side story here, which is that lab eventually spun off as a startup and offered as a product doing expression recognition on anything, which is sort of an odd product. It sounds really cool until you think, well, what the hell do I do with it? Which is where they found themselves. And then deep neural network came along, and suddenly massive performance gains. And they had this very clever idea. About 2 years ago, they did a real-time facial expression analysis of one of the early Republican presidential debates, when there was like 78,000 of them on stage, and everyone's wondering, does Ted Cruz actually have human emotions? So they ran this thing real time, and literally the bidding war starts the next day between Facebook and Apple. And Apple One, if you've got an iPhone 10, all the fancy phone stuff on there was my undergraduate lab, which includes the emojis and so forth, which actually tells, again, totally off topic, but tells an interesting story about innovation in fields like this. I mean, how many dozens of dissertations worth of research went in developing that technology, 20 years of development, projects doing spook work for the CIA, and it all turns out to animate cat faces on your phone. Like, that's what all innovation becomes in the end, is cats. It's like a magic. It's a golden rule of digital innovation. So that was my introduction. But even back then, way back then, I was thinking not, can we build an artificial general intelligence? I only got to hear the two previous speakers here, but I'm going to guess people have talked about what that is. That's an artificial intelligence that's as intelligent or more intelligent than we are. And I always thought, but we already have this amazing intelligence. Couldn't we just make it better? Couldn't we help people to do more, or take people that have a disorder or damage and help them with what they're doing? And it was a real passion of mine. On my website for 20 years now, it has said, what if it were 20 plus or minus 2? So this is a reference to this very famous, one of the original, most famous papers in all of cognitive psychology, which is this idea of working memory, which is a fairly complex idea if you research it now today, but the spirit of it is somewhat straightforward. We can remember a very limited amount of stuff at any given moment. It limits our attention. It limits the number of things we can pay attention to, the complexity of an argument you can follow, the richness of our imagination, how many digits you can hold in mind as a phone number. And it always makes me, if you've ever done a lot of conference calling, how long it takes for systems to change. Really, I'm in my car on a smartphone. There's no way I'm going to spit out a 13-number PIN to, off the top of my head to be able to log in and make this call. Yet we still build it that way because the assumption is you're in a conference room somewhere. So, but what if you could? What would happen? And essentially, it's like a classic philosophical question. Do you believe the world would be a better place if everyone was a little smarter? So what I'm not going to do right now is a deep tour of the entire field of neurotechnology and its history and everything. Instead, I want to do something very different, which is to go into that one specific question. What would happen if we could modestly expand working memory, both from the neurotechnology perspective, but for me, a much more important perspective, which is, what does it actually mean to be human? What does it mean to be a society? What happens economically when we do these sorts of things? These are incredibly important questions that I will frankly and blatantly say most people that do my sort of work don't think about at all. It's just invent, 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 and it's not my responsibility with what happens with it. My job is to invent and explore. It's our responsibility to decide what happens with it. And if we don't explore these questions, we can't make a good decision. And we're reaping some of this right now at this very moment. So let's start with why AI is good. Then let's redefine artificial intelligence. So I do a lot of different work, loosely in the space of machine learning and artificial intelligence. I left academia about 12 years ago to become an entrepreneur, like most of the idiots around here. And I founded a number of companies since then. The one thing I will say about them is they tend to have a certain flavor. I'm interested in making better people. It turns out, for me, the machine learning is just a tool. And frankly, that's all it ever has been, is just a tool. It's an amazing tool. But it is just a tool. If you think it will solve your problems for you, you are going to be really disappointed. And you probably won't know you're disappointed until you realize what a terrible job it's done in solving your problems. Everyone seems to think that people like me are like Hermione Granger and Harry Potter, and we wave wands and like magically problems get solved. And that's not what it is at all. But it is an amazing tool. And I agree with you about why it's so important. So I have had the privilege, for example, of building a system actually based on the face recognition technology I learned to do as an undergrad, building a system to reunite orphan refugees with extended family members. I can't think of an existence that's worse than being an orphan refugee. In a refugee camp somewhere in northern Syria, which technically you're not a refugee, you're a displaced person, but maybe getting into Turkey or into Iraq. And an uncle is worried in Damascus, hasn't heard from his sister's family in months, goes to a UN camp. They used to give him a book with 1 million photographs in it. And that's not the history of the UN. That would be how many kids are in refugee camps right then. So we built this system. You play essentially a little game in 2 or 3 minutes if your niece is anywhere in the world you found her. I had things walk into my life. My son, 6 years ago, was diagnosed with diabetes. And yes, that was a shock because neither family has a history. But the real shock was a month later when we go in for his first outpatient visit. And they gave us a sheet of paper to handwrite numbers down, 15 of them, blood glucose levels. And then a doctor looked at those numbers and decided what the treatment plan should be. And I thought, are you, not using the language I used then, but are you kidding me? Like, I make models of the brain. Are you telling me diabetes is more complex than the brain? That's nuts. So we hacked all of his equipment. Turned out I broke several federal laws in doing that, which I had the fun of telling the president about. The last one. My invitations to the White House for the last year just vanished. I had lost in the mail somehow. We hacked all these things, and I sent the data to my server, and I built a model that predicts about an hour into the future whether his blood glucose levels will go high or low. Now, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry and a real human problem. Type 2 diabetes. I was just in Kuala Lumpur. There's the biggest bank in Southeast Asia. I was meeting with them, and they told me, just sort of as in passing, their single biggest expense after salaries is treatment for type 2 diabetes. This is a big deal all around the world. And it turns out no one had ever applied artificial intelligence to this problem before. I don't like starting companies in the health space, so we just gave it away. Eli Lilly, for example, is using a deep neural network version of this model that, at least in simulations, works better than a real pancreas. It's like, wow, that comes with its own ethical implications. Do you allow them to compete in the Olympics? If you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, do you get a prophylactic artificial pancreas ahead of time? But you can do real human good. We built a system that predicts manic episodes in bipolar sufferers a couple weeks ahead of their subjective experience of its onset. 25% of those people will go on to kill themselves. If you say no to technologies like this, because there are scary sides to it, by the way, none of which is I keep catching myself because there are little kids in the room, none of which is the stuff Elon Musk is talking about. As far as I can turn, don't worry. I know you're not little. I'm just super, super old, and I have a really dirty sense of humor. So I mean, the only reason I figure Elon is spouting off is because it does this magical thing is when he holds his earnings reports, no one asks him why he lost $400 million, because instead he shot a car into space. So, you know, maybe artificial general intelligence is coming. In my opinion, no one's invented the technology that will lead to it, but it's entirely possible. But I'll say this. There is a world in the not too distant future in which we have an intelligence greater than our own, and it's us. And that is just as scary and just as profound and potentially amazing as the idea of artificial general intelligence. And so I went to school thinking I'd be working on brains, and then I got introduced to working on computers, and I just thought, what if you could do the best of both? My first introduction to that was in grad school at Carnegie Mellon, Sebastian Thrun there, and a number of other people that would go on to have a real big impact in the space. And my first experience was working on cochlear implants. So this is the only really commonly available what's called neuroprosthetic today, which is to say a technology where you jam wires into your brain. In this case, brain, it's the 8th cranial nerve, the auditory nerve. And they basically take a hearing aid and they just wire it in. And when I say jam, that's pretty much an accurate description of what they do. You can't see into the bone, so they just kind of force it in and cross their fingers and hope it all lines up. You do this in a little kid, and it's controversial in the deaf community. But you do this in a little kid, particularly a baby, and when they grow up, you have to run experiments on them to tell they were ever deaf. You do it in someone my age or older, and they'll often turn the hearing aid off because the sound is so bad. It's like hearing the world composed through 6 garbage disposals, which is not the greatest experience. Turns out, with a nice plastic brain, one that can learn, one that's younger than mine, it makes sense of it all. It's amazing. Brains are amazing, and we have invented nothing that comes close. Yet, those systems that we were just talking about are also amazing, and they do amazing things, even in creative spaces. So how do we get the best of both? So again, I could go into a lot of detail in a number of spaces. Here's one that's just provocative, so I'll throw it out. My think tank is doing some collaborative work with the ACLU right now, and they were rather shocked to discover that if I do something called transcranial stimulation, in a certain part of the brain, people will be more honest. And that has some really interesting implications for the law. You know, if I just make you wear a funny hat while you sit on the stand to give testimony, and we turn this thing on, and suddenly we can believe that you are some percentage more honest and trustworthy, that's interesting. But what does it mean about constitutional guarantees of self-incrimination and other sorts of questions? Really profound. And this is, again, part of the space that neurotechnologies get into. But let's focus on this one. So, the actual technology side. If I wanted to make a smarter person, what could I do? So it turns out a lot of this has already been worked on. And there's some great groundwork in this space, and it's a little complicated. It's one of the reasons why I'm not going to go into a lot of the technical details. But it turns out a lot of what working memory is a relationship between our frontal lobes, this thing that we might all sort of think of as us. Sometimes it's called executive control. I don't think that's always the best way of thinking about it, but it's this part that in perhaps the language of the behavioral economists and thinking fast and slow, it's the slow part. It's the deliberative part. It's what we might think of as a more rational part. And then you have the rest of your brain, which is doing incredibly crucial work, but is a little bit more yoked to the world. So our sensory systems are meant to represent the sensory world. And if you want to remember something that just happened, you need to override that. And in some sense, that's what your frontal system is doing. So when we look at working memory span, what we find is there are these really crucial areas our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, for one, is probably the most crucial. And activity there indicates a certain degree of this control over the rest of our experience in the brain. And where do we see that play out? Well, you've probably heard of, and I'm sure some of you are much more sophisticated in this than others, which is always challenging with an audience, but you probably have heard of basic brain waves, putting things like an EEG on someone so you can see different patterns of electrical activity across their brain. So one of the broadest sets of patterns are just these rhythms. So we see alpha and beta and gamma and delta rhythms. So someone made this fascinating discovery that one of the signatures of working memory span is not a specific rhythm or just a specific region in the brain, but the interaction of all of these things. So it turns out it's very complex. But it turns out certain gamma rhythms in frontal areas, when they are in sync, yoked, when they are coupled to a different set of rhythms, theta rhythms, in the parietal and more posterior regions, that is the signature of working memory in process. So someone had this idea. What if we could intervene on that process to increase it? One of those people is I have a couple of applied neuroscience companies of my own, and one is one of that, but there's a lab up at UCSF that's working on this. There's a lab here. A lot of people are working in this space. So how would you possibly do this? You know this thing is true. How would you build a technology? Well, you've got two options. The first is the brute force option, in a sense, which is jam things in the brain. So this is invasive neuroprosthetics, in this case, cognitive neuroprosthetics. The other is non-invasive, which is something that works from the outside. In fact, DARPA, already mentioned a couple of times, just put out a big call for proposals for high-resolution, non-invasive neurotechnologies. And if people really crack this, it would be amazing, because brain surgery is not always people's first choice for self-improvement if you don't have a life-threatening illness. Although I will tell you, I always get volunteers at the ends of all of my talks, because the punchline, which I will get to in a bit, is we can genuinely make you smarter, and the 1% of you that survive the surgery. But that's just a numbers game. If you're willing to play it with me, we'll get enough people.
Pink noise.
So what can you actually do? Well, it turns out, I mentioned this thing EEG, which again, I'm sure you've heard of before. So this is just a set of electrodes on the surface of the skull, and they're recording sort of, in a sense, the collective electrical activity across your brain. And this activity is all smeared. You get great time resolution, terrible spatial, really hard without deeper insights to know where things are happening. But it gives you something to work with, and you can pick up on these broad rhythms. We'll then pair that with another thing I mentioned earlier, which is transcranial stimulation. More particular in this case, something called transcranial alternating current stimulation. So, and essentially, originally they just used magnets. So they take a big magnet and they'd stick it next to a certain part of your head. They say this is scientists doing deeply ethical research about things we had no idea what the long-term results would be. And you just flip the magnet on and off, bam. And again, what goes on is fairly complex. It tends to cause the cells to line up, and then you release them, and they all fall back, and everything goes haywire. And then you could see, how important was this brain region in X? Bzzz. Oh, it turns out you need that to be able to breathe, so that would be the pons. So you need to be really careful the magnet doesn't get anywhere near that again. But for a cognitive scientist, it was fascinating to be able to go and treat a human brain the way we had been treating animal brains for a long time, but also the way we could actually treat an artificial brain, which is zap different parts, make them dysfunctional, and then see what happens as a result. Turns out this is not the magic trick to actually understanding the brain, but it was useful in making some progress. But after the fairly diffuse effects of magnets got explored, people started looking at, well, what if we sort of trickle direct current electrical activity and then alternating current? So what is neat about alternating current is it isn't just pure stimulation. You can sync it with things you're interested in. Well, remember what I said, this signature of working memory in action is a kind of a syncing, a coupling between the rhythms in two different parts of the brain. So if I've got the apparatus to record those rhythms, and I've got the apparatus to entrain those rhythms and move them around a little bit, if we could improve the coupling, maybe we could improve the memory. And it turns out there's been several papers showing exactly that. You put a big ugly hat on, and they crank the wheel, and the hamsters start going, and everything starts running, and it's not a huge effect. But you see, the famous paper I mentioned earlier, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, depending on where you are in the world of cognitive science, you might think different things about how valid those numbers are. But let's just take them as sort of like a magic scale that doesn't mean anything but is a rating. Well, it turns out in that scale space, doing the little trick I just described gets you an extra number. So why is that important? I mean, you can appreciate that knowing one extra digit on a phone number could be useful for your memory. But what does it actually mean to be that person? Well, this turns out to be something we've studied for a long time. A big chunk of my work and my research really isn't about AI. In any ways, I investigate augmentative intelligence, not artificial intelligence. I want to know the best of the two together. But in fact, my work is really about people. And in fact, we call it life outcomes research, the vast majority of which has not been done by me. It's done by some amazing people here, like Carol Dweck and the Stanford Literacy Project and many others, groups all around the world looking at constructs that are predictive of life outcomes, and in some cases, almost certainly causally related to them. And one of those is working memory span. The bigger that number, let's say on this 7 scale, you're 9, what does that tell me? It's hard to say what it tells me about a specific person, but if it were in this whole room, those of you with higher numbers will live longer, you'll go further in your education, and you'll earn more money. And they're almost certainly causally related. It might be mediated through other things, but we can clearly see these differences. Now, it's true there are some people with phenomenally large working memory spans that have rather modest jobs. It's not magic. It's not the one thing that if anyone got right, but at a population level, you see this big thing. So if you're 9, you have significant advantages in your life. If you're a 5, it doesn't mean you can't be a doctor. It doesn't mean you can't be a CEO. Clearly, it doesn't mean you can't be president. But if you're 5, things are stacked against you. It will be harder. It's harder to follow those complex arguments. It's harder to understand those equations that will get you a job tomorrow at Facebook. I've had the great pleasure of turning down a lot of those jobs. So this is one of the things to think about. What would it mean if everyone was smarter? Well, economically, it's a little challenging. Would everyone actually make more money if we could add a digit onto their working memory span? Does the economy work that way? It's not 100% clear. It's an experiment that is impossible to run beyond just doing it and seeing what happens, which is not always an ethical way to run an experiment. Would everyone go further in their education? Harder to say, but seems a little more likely that that's true, although in some sense that's just a mediator towards a better life in general anyways. Would they live longer? I think unambiguously they would, because most of that is mediated through better diet, which comes through that executive part of yourself saying, I really would love to eat 3 more servings of fries, but I'm not going to. And so in that sense, almost certainly people would live longer, healthier lives. And they might make more money, and they might go further in their education. And you start to think about what that means ethically at scale. So now we're into ethics. The whole self-driving car thing has brought AI and ethics right to the fore, and how should it make decisions? That car killed a woman, should it have swerved and killed the passenger instead? All sorts of questions like this. Well, needless to say, neurotechnologies have profound ethical implications. And the first of them is just, should we be fiddling around with the human brain? Should we change people? Yes, in theory, we could add 1 point to everyone's working memory span. And this is early days, so we could maybe assume a few points. But should we be doing it all? Well, here's my response to that. We already do. And we do it in profound ways at massive scale around the world. We know with excruciating molecular detail how things like childhood household stress causally decreases working memory span. We know how social isolation decreases long-term capability and decreases prosocial behavior in these deep molecular level models. So we do this already. And we do it to vast numbers of children around the world who are born with the potential of being one person and never will be. The person who cured the fatal disease your child will someday get was just born in Dakar. And they will never have the chance to become the person that actually discovers that cure. And that's a terrible thing and a huge part of what my work is about. I don't magically think that jamming stuff in people's brains fixes any of this, but it comes into my thinking, which is not making a choice is a moral choice. Choosing not to try and develop something and explore the possibilities is just as ethically bankrupt as thoughtlessly spreading it everywhere. I say this as someone, for example, probably the 6 months prior to my son's diagnosis, I must have been on Google every day, Googling about bedwetting. Turns out, in retrospect, so obvious, it's the only way his body could get rid of the extra sugar that was building up. But I didn't know it at the time, and I would swear I never read anything about diabetes. I must have, but I don't remember. So I'll say this, as someone that builds exactly algorithms like this, Google knew. I'm not saying anyone there literally knew or that they had the algorithm running, but they had the capability of better than chance giving me some insight into what was going on. And having worked with a lot of people there and elsewhere, they made the very explicit choice that they wouldn't do that. They felt it was very Big Brother, to which I respond, you know, I might actually want to be involved in that choice to some degree. And that, in fact, doing nothing is its own moral decision. You can't just say, I'm not participating, if you have the ability to make a difference. So this is part of my thinking here. We're already engaged. And by the way, we know also how to drive it in the other direction. And this, I've mentioned the Stanford Literacy Project as an earlier example. Read to your kids. This increases long-term cognitive capability in very clear ways. In fact, reading is just one rich, discursive interactions. More adult-like, the better. This is the wonderful stuff that you can do. But what if we had the ability? So let's take it the next step. So I'm running out of time, so let's just say the other thing, which is the invasive technologies. There's some cool stuff. There's cool stuff going on all over the world. Since I'm limited on time, I'm a huge fan of what's called neural dust. This is a nanotechnology being developed at Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley Labs. It's just little, essentially, nanochips. You could, in theory, just sprinkle thousands of them across the brain. They're about the size of a grain of salt. They fit very nicely on a nerve fiber. You can imagine the kind of amazing resolution they can get. It's so cool. They are powered by and read out through hypersonic signals. So you just play a high-pitched sound no one can hear, and the whole thing runs, and it's amazing. Give me that, and I'll give you a trivial case. You could walk down the street, just using published research. Walk down the street, imagine yourself up an email, and send it off. Would it be perfect? No, it might occasionally get a little mistranslation. Believe me, we've got a long ways to go in my field. But in theory, without inventing new technologies, totally doable. So now we're talking about working memory technologies, not only through these diffuse external signals that require big ugly hats and lots of battery power, but in detail, inside. Not do we add 1 or 2 to working memory, but do we help offload and reload specific memories so that we might get up to the 20 plus or minus 2. And what would it mean for the world to have 20 plus or minus 2 people. There are no such, as we call them, neurotypical people in the world today. You know, even on a campus like this, the highest you'll run across is someone typically in the low teens. What would it be if the average across the world was higher than the highest person right now? And again, this is not meant to be the one thing that defines human intelligence or the only thing that's important. I'm just using this as an example. And I don't think we could know. I don't think we have any idea what such a world would be like, any more than we have any idea post-singularity what an artificial general intelligence would do with the world. We do have some greater sense in that we know that they would be human-like, and I actually am fairly skeptical that pure AI superintelligences would actually be very human-like. It's a totally different talk, but I actually once debated Ray Kurzweil about AI stuff. The best compliment I've ever received in my life was him. After the debate, he leaned over and said, "Who the hell are you?" This has been a fascinating space to work in. But here is the closing big ethical question, and it's a societal one. Right now, our children's part of their cognitive, their economic outcomes, I mean, go read Raj Chetty's new studies right now. They're awesome. Economist right here, I think upshooing someday for a Nobel Prize. And you see very clearly the outcomes of your children are a function of how wealthy you are. And that's the world I mean, in some deep ways, even controlling for genetic similarity. That is fascinating, and it's profound, and it's disappointing. What happens when they can just buy it? What happens when the horsepower in your children's head is a function, it's like a sweet 16. You know, it's just a function of what your family can afford. That is truly disturbing. And I don't even need to imagine a world in which there's terrible people, right? If we only give it to the best people in the world, it's still a world in which they would see us as suffering from Down syndrome, and almost, in a sense, have a moral obligation to take care of us. How would it be ethical for them to allow us to make our own decisions? But that genuinely concerns me. And what concerns me even more, and I'll finish with this funny little bit here, is, you know, where my company that's doing the work, so this is non-invasive working memory augmentation, it's not from DARPA, it's not from the medical industry for health purposes, it's from the professional computer gaming industry, who are happy to wear a stupid hat and get a tiny advantage to take their purses. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say the terms professional computer gaming, because you have maybe slightly white hair and a Caucasian face, go do a little Google searching on this for China and Japan, and you will see just how huge this is becoming. And it's becoming big here also. It's a multi-million-dollar sports industry in which no one actually built muscle. And they are willing to pay anything to get a little bit of extra advantage. And outside of them, the two biggest funders are DARPA and the Chinese military. And all of that is fairly scary. And it's one of the reasons I feel a requirement to do this sort of work is because the people that fund it and the people that do the inventing shouldn't people be the ones that decide how it gets used. And having the chance to come here today and share this area of work with you, barring, I didn't go into a lot of technical details, I know, but having to share that this work is happening. And in 20 to 30 years, I have no idea if we will ever get artificial general intelligence. In theory, sure, but in practice, yet to be discovered. This, in 20 to 30 years, may well change the definition of what it means to be human. And this is something we should start thinking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.